Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the quiet, expressionless world of old portraits, a time when people stared into cameras and canvases with the emotional range of a brick wall. No smiles, no sparkle, just that timeless I've seen things look. You've seen them too, those sepia-toned faces from the past that look like they're either deeply offended or slightly constipated. But tonight, we're going to find out why. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this from anywhere interesting, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing who's still awake at weird hours. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a dimly lit hallway of an old European gallery. The smell of polished wood and varnish lingers in the air. All around you, hundreds of faces stare back. Kings, merchants, mysterious women in lace collars, and not one of them smiles. It's almost eerie. You shift your gaze, half expecting one of them to blink. But no, every pair of eyes follows you silently, frozen in time. Lips sealed like they've all agreed on some secret rule. Thou shalt not grin. It wasn't just photography that captured this seriousness. It started long before cameras were even invented. In ancient paintings, whether it was a Roman bust or a Renaissance masterpiece, the faces were solemn, composed, sometimes downright melancholy. You could say they invented the resting serious face. And yet, people back then weren't emotionless robots. They laughed, joked, danced, and fought just like we do. But when it came to being immortalized, whether in marble or on canvas, smiling was simply not done. You didn't pose with a goofy grin. You posed like you were auditioning for eternity. There's something haunting about that, right? Imagine standing for hours. Yes, hours, while an artist slowly recreated your every detail with brushes dipped in pigment and oil. The slightest twitch could ruin the entire composition. And let's be honest, holding a smile for that long, not going to happen. Your face would cramp before the artist even finished your nose. But there's a deeper reason to, and this one's fascinating. In early Western art, the goal wasn't to capture you as you are. It was to capture your status, your soul, and your place in the grand scheme of things. A serious face meant dignity. It said, I am not of the common crowd. I have composure. I have purpose. Smiling. That was for jesters, servants, and children. Not for the elite who commissioned portraits. That would hang in halls for centuries. You can almost hear the painter mumbling, now please, sir, hold still, and whatever you do, don't look happy. There's even an old idea that in certain eras, smiling too much was seen as a sign of foolishness, or worse, madness. Scholars still argue whether this was tied to religious values of the time or just societal stiffness. But either way, the result was the same. People learned to hide joy behind a mask of calm restraint. Oddly enough, there are exceptions. A few medieval paintings, especially of peasants and tavern scenes, show people laughing or grinning with crooked teeth and flushed cheeks. But those weren't noble portraits. They were moral warnings. The message was basically, Look at these fools. See how indulgence looks. Joy, painted too vividly, was often linked to sin. And so, century after century, we inherited this unspoken rule that solemnity equals seriousness, and seriousness equals worth. Even when early photographers appeared with their big boxy cameras and dangerous flash powders, people kept that same composure. You could say the no-smile tradition survived the jump from brush to lens. But here's the ironic twist. The very first time you see an old photo of a smiling person, it looks wrong, unnatural, even ghostly. That's how deep the habit runs. You step closer to one of those portraits in your imagination, maybe a stiff Victorian gentleman with slick hair and tight collar. His eyes are grey, his posture perfect, and you realize he's not sad. He's performing importance. He's saying, "This is how I want history to remember me." One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people. The famous Mona Lisa, often hailed as the most mysterious smile in history, was actually groundbreaking because she smiled at all. Her subtle grin was seen as radical in its time, a delicate rebellion against centuries of blank faces. Da Vinci, in his perfectionist madness, painted something few dared to show: human warmth. And even now, 5 centuries later, we're still obsessed with that tiny hint of emotion. Scholars still argue whether she's smiling out of amusement, love, or if it's just a trick of the eyes. Maybe she's mocking us, the way you might smirk when someone tells you to act serious. In your mind, the gallery fades, and you imagine a candlelit room somewhere in Florence. 1505, a woman sits, hands folded, trying not to laugh as Leonardo murmurs about light and shadow. She shifts slightly, lips curling into that faint, immortal smile, and suddenly, history changes course. The still faces of history never truly disappear. They just evolve. Even your modern passport photo, strict, unsmiling, sterile, owes something to that ancient legacy. Bureaucracy has replaced nobility, but the expression remains blank, obedient, an eternal dot. You step back from the canvas, feeling that mix of unease and curiosity. Maybe, deep down, people of the past weren't avoiding smiles. Maybe they were preserving something deeper, the idea that being still meant being remembered. And as you wander down the hallway of silent faces, one thought lingers. If someone painted or photographed you today, how would you want to be remembered? You find yourself standing in a dim, dusty room, a tiny photography studio from the mid-1800s. A wooden tripod creaks in the corner. The camera looks more like a piece of furniture than a device. A man with rolled up sleeves is adjusting a brass lens with the concentration of a surgeon. And there you are, sitting perfectly still on a stiff-backed chair, waiting for your soul to be captured on a glass plate. The photographer gives you one simple instruction: don't move, not even a blink. You think it'll be easy, but seconds stretch into minutes. Your neck starts to ache. Your lips tremble. You want to smile, maybe just a little. But that tiny twitch would ruin everything. Because this is the age of long exposure. When taking a single photograph could take anywhere from 15 seconds to several minutes. Imagine trying to hold a grin that long without looking like a maniac. So people did the sensible thing: they froze, expressionless, stoic, motionless. That's the funny paradox of early photography. It was supposed to capture life as it was, yet everyone in those pictures looks half dead. The reason wasn't that they didn't want to smile. It's that physics literally wouldn't let them. Those cameras needed massive light and painfully long exposure times. You couldn't move, you couldn't blink, and God forbid you breathe too hard. Early photographers even used iron neck braces to keep people still. Yes, you heard that right, an actual brace clamped behind your head, hidden by your hair or collar, to make sure you didn't flinch during the shoot. You sit there in your imagination, chin pressed against a cold metal frame, eyes watering under the glare of harsh sunlight or chemical flash. Suddenly, smiling doesn't sound so natural anymore. And it wasn't just the physics, it was the attitude. Photography, when it first appeared in the 1830s and 1840s, wasn't about fun or personality. It was a serious, expensive event. Having your photo taken was almost sacred, like having your portrait painted by an artist. It marked your place in the world, a frozen proof that you existed. A mainstream historical fact here: the first known photograph of a human being was taken by Louis Daguerre in 1838. A street scene in Paris. The exposure lasted nearly 10 minutes. The only reason we see the man is because he happened to stand still long enough while getting his shoes polished. Everyone else moved too fast to register. It's eerie. The world blurred away, but one silent figure remains. That's the mood of early photography. Stillness as survival. Scholars still argue whether that stiffness was purely technical or cultural. Did people look serious because the camera demanded it? Or because they wanted to look dignified for future generations? Probably both. Imagine if each photo cost you a week's wages. You'd want to look important too. And yet, there were always those rare rebels. A few brave souls who risked a smile in the 19th century, like a man named Cornelius, who took one of the earliest self-portraits, yes, the original selfie in 1839. His faint smile seems accidental, like he's trying not to laugh at how absurd the process feels. The result: a photo that somehow looks more alive than all the rest. But those moments were exceptions. Most people sat there with that polite, blank, get this over with look. You can almost hear their inner monologue. Don't sneeze. Don't move. Don't. Oh no. I blinked. And when you finally finished your session, you didn't get an instant preview like your phone screen. Today, nope. You waited hours, even days, for the image to develop. Sometimes it came out beautifully. Sometimes it was a smudged ghost. Imagine holding that fragile, silvery plate, seeing your own reflection staring back from the shadows, not quite smiling, not quite sad, just suspended. There's something almost meditative about that slowness. You start realizing that the people in those old photographs weren't dull or miserable. They were simply adapting to the strange technology of their time. They treated photography with the same patience and respect we reserve for rituals. Odd historical detail. Some families actually photographed their deceased relatives, posing them as if still alive, a practice called memento mori photography. It sounds morbid now, but back then, it was a way of keeping loved ones close in a world where life was fragile and short. They didn't smile either. But then again, how could they? You shift in your imaginary chair, neck stiff, eyes locked on the lens. The photographer mutters something about hold still, just a moment longer, and suddenly you feel the absurdity of it all. The room smells of chemicals and dust. The light burns your eyes. You want to laugh, but you can't. Then, click, the shutter snaps. The moment is trapped. A small explosion of magnesium flash leaves a white spot in your vision. For a second, you're blind. Then it fades, and you're left blinking, dazed, and slightly sweaty. The photographer smiles for the first time tonight. Perfect. You look timeless. And you do. Because that image, unsmiling and still, will outlast you by centuries. People in the future will look at it, squint, and wonder why you seem so serious, never realizing that you were just waiting for the flash to die and the air to clear. So next time you see those ghostly old portraits, remember, it wasn't sadness, it was endurance. Smiling was a luxury time didn't allow. You stand, stretching your stiff neck, the imaginary weight of that iron brace still lingering. Somewhere, deep in your mind, the echoes of that click still ring, a frozen heartbeat from another century. You step out of that dusty photo studio, and suddenly, you're in a candlelit ballroom somewhere in the 1700s. Velvet drapes, gold-trimmed mirrors, perfume so thick you can almost taste it. And in the center of it, all nobles standing in perfect posture, like mannequins in wigs. The air hums with polite conversation, laughter muffled behind fans, and powdered faces. You wander through the crowd and realize something odd. No one is really smiling. Their lips twitch politely, sure, but no teeth, no wide grins. It's as if joy itself has a curfew. You catch your reflection in a mirror and suddenly feel out of place, too relaxed, too human. Because in this world, seriousness equals prestige. Back then, how you looked wasn't just about fashion. It was a declaration of your class, your intellect, and your control over yourself. The rich didn't just want to appear powerful. They wanted to look unbothered. Smiles were for people who didn't have to prove anything. Or worse, for people trying too hard. You imagine posing for a portrait as an 18th century noble. The painter adjusts your chin slightly, muttering a little higher. Sir, yes, perfect. Now, dignity. You try to smile, but he frowns, sighs, and says softly, perhaps. Less joy, more legacy. That phrase captures everything. Legacy. That's what portraits were about. You weren't being painted for your friends to post you on social media. You were being painted for your descendants, for history itself. A single image that would hang in your family's estate for centuries. Would you risk looking goofy in that? Probably not. One mainstream historical fact. In Renaissance and Baroque portraiture, especially across Europe, artists like Rembrandt, Van Dyck, and Titian deliberately emphasized solemn expressions. They believed the face should reflect the soul. Calm, wise, eternal. A smile, fleeting and mortal, was too trivial for eternity. Even in the 19th century, when photography took over, people still carried that mindset. A straight face wasn't just habit, it was identity. Scholars still argue whether this obsession with composure came from religious values. humility before God or social performance, displaying control and intelligence. But whichever side is right, one thing's certain: the higher your status, the less you smiled. It's strange, isn't it? How something as natural as smiling became a class symbol. The rich suppressed it to appear noble. The poor, meanwhile, were often depicted smiling. Too much in art, usually to highlight their simplicity or foolishness. A cruel visual language of the time. Joy was for those who didn't know better. You walk deeper into the ballroom. A woman in pearls glides past you, her face composed like porcelain. She nods slightly, a gesture rehearsed over years. Her fan flutters open and shut, her laughter hidden behind it, soft, controlled, polite. You realize even laughter here is rationed, and yet there's irony in the air. These people, so desperate to appear powerful, are actually trapped by their own image. Their portraits, the ones they hoped would immortalize them, now make them all look the same. Blank eyes, pursed lips, frozen pride. Odd historical detail? There were portrait coaches in high society, people who literally trained you on how to pose properly for your painting. They taught you how to hold your chin, where to rest your hands, and most importantly, how not to smile, because showing too much emotion was vulgar. Imagine someone correcting your grin because it looked too happy. You pass a wall lined with paintings. Every face stares down at you with that same expression, calm, detached, untouchable. And yet, you can almost feel the tension beneath it. The effort it took to appear effortless. It's funny how we still carry bits of that today. The serious face lives on in corporate photos, graduation portraits, even passport pictures. It's the same visual code. I am respectable. I am composed. And while we've relaxed a little over the centuries, that old ghost of class-conscious posing still lingers. But the truth? Most of those people weren't always that cold. Diaries, letters, and even early caricatures reveal that they laughed, played games, and threw chaotic parties that lasted until sunrise. Their real smiles existed, just not in art. One painting comes to mind, a rare 18th century sketch showing Marie Antoinette laughing with her ladies-in-waiting. It was never meant for public display, but it feels alive. You see her as a person, not a symbol. Scholars still argue whether the sketch is authentic, but if it is, it's one of the few glimpses of humanity that history accidentally allowed to slip through its polished armor. And that's the irony of prestige. The more people tried to look eternal, the less human they became. You walk past the last painting in the ballroom, a nobleman's portrait. The man's gaze follows you, proud and detached. Yet something about his expression feels forced, as if behind that controlled face there was once a real man who wanted to laugh but didn't dare. You whisper under your breath, "It's okay. You can smile now." For a brief, impossible second, it almost looks like he does. You find yourself stepping into a dimly lit apothecary. The smell of herbs and alcohol thick in the air. Shelves lined with jars and strange tools gleam under flickering candlelight. And there it hits you. One reason people didn't smile in portraits wasn't just about pride, class, or camera constraints. No, this one's a little more personal. Their teeth were terrifying. Yes, Really, dental care in the 17th and 18th centuries was a horror show by modern standards. Sugar was a rising luxury, tooth decay ran rampant, and tooth extraction was brutal, often done without anesthesia. You wander past a jar of dried herbs and a crude metal tool and shiver. Imagine trying to smile naturally when half your teeth are rotten or missing. The polite, closed-mouth expression suddenly makes perfect sense. And it wasn't just aesthetics. Health was a real concern. Infections could spread from abscessed teeth to the jaw or even the bloodstream. People avoided smiling not just out of vanity, but out of self-preservation. You can almost hear them whispering behind fans or collars. Better to look serious than reveal my cavity-ridden secret. Odd historical detail? Some wealthy Europeans actually had tooth prosthetics made from human or animal teeth. Imagine sitting for your noble portrait with a mouth full of carefully carved replacements, trying not to drool as the painter leaned in to capture every angle. No wonder smiles were rare. It was like posing for a modern selfie with an uncomfortable retainer glued to your jaw. You wander deeper into this imaginary clinic, noticing pamphlets warning against excessive laughter as a cause of tooth cracking. People were genuinely cautious. Scholars still argue whether these warnings were scientific or mostly superstition. But either way, the effect on portraiture was real. Nobody wanted to risk embarrassment. And let's not forget oral hygiene, or the lack thereof. Toothbrushes existed, but were rudimentary. People often used cloths, twigs, or powders made of crushed shells and charcoal. Sometimes they brushed too aggressively, wearing enamel away and leaving gums tender. You can almost see the grimaces behind those stiff poses. A tiny twitch suppressed because it might expose pain. Even children weren't exempt. You imagine a young boy being photographed for his first family portrait. His tiny teeth are half missing, gums swollen from infection. He's told to sit still, face forward, lips closed. No giggling allowed. And yet, in private, he probably laughed at the smallest things, holding his mouth tightly just in case. Mainstream historical fact. In Victorian England, people often removed decayed teeth for portraits, preferring a closed-lip smile. Some even wore small mouth props to hide gaps. You thought your braces were bad? Try surviving an era where smiling could ruin your social standing, or worse, reveal your dental misery. You wander past a small wooden chair with a photography. The air feels heavier, as if all those suppressed smiles still linger here, trapped between the walls. Every time someone held a stiff pose, they were not only resisting the camera, but also concealing 1,000 little oral secrets. And yet, behind all the seriousness, humanity persisted. Letters and diaries reveal that people had a dark sense of humor about their teeth. They joked about silver, mouths, gums blackened from decay, or ivory-less grins. There's even one quip from a French noblewoman complaining that she would have to smile with my eyes only, lest the artist witness the ruin. Beneath, you can almost hear her giggle, quietly in the candlelight. It's strangely comforting, isn't it? Even centuries ago, humans were resourceful, managing appearances, maintaining dignity, and still finding humor in their struggles. And that's why the closed-mouth portrait survives. It's a perfect disguise, a blend of necessity and culture. By the time you leave the apothecary, the faint metallic smell still clings to your imagination. You realize that every stoic face in a painting or photograph is not only a statement of status, but also a clever workaround for what life made impossible. In other words, those silent, serious expressions, they were survival, dignity, comedy hidden behind restraint. And as you step back into the gallery of frozen faces, you can almost imagine a whisper from the past. We smiled, just very carefully. You drift through a quiet museum wing, the faint creak of floorboards beneath your feet. The walls are lined with gilded frames holding the work of long-dead masters. You stop and stare, realizing something. Before the invention of photography, painting ruled expression. It wasn't just art, it was authority, storytelling, and, strangely enough, a very strict guide to how you could look. In those days, portraits weren't snapshots of life. They were carefully staged narratives. A noble woman wasn't just a person. She was virtue personified. A king wasn't just a man. He was power made flesh. And you, dear viewer, were expected to follow the rules if you were ever to sit for a painter. Smiling was off limits. It suggested frivolity, weakness, or moral laxity. You step closer to one particular canvas, a grand Baroque painting of a wealthy merchant. His eyes are sharp, lips pressed into a straight line, hands folded delicately over a table stacked with ledgers and coins. Even though he is surrounded by symbols of abundance and status, he looks almost tense, and yet the portrait is meant to convey control and success. A mainstream historical fact: in Renaissance Italy, commissioning a portrait could cost a small fortune, sometimes equivalent to several months of a craftsman's wages. Painters like Titian, Holbein, and Van Eyck were meticulous, spending hours, sometimes weeks, perfecting every fold of a sleeve, the glint of a ring, or the curl of hair. This was not a time for casual expressions. Every gesture, every facial line was symbolic. And yet, the weirdest part? Even painters had their limits. Scholars still argue whether the subtle hints of a smile that occasionally appear in these portraits were intentional, or just artifacts of the artist's brush. Those tiny upturned corners of the lips are almost rebellious, as if the painter secretly thought, let's let them breathe a little humanity. You wander past a portrait of a young girl holding a bouquet. She has a faint, ghostly smile, barely noticeable. Oddly enough, it's one of the few examples where childhood innocence and joy were allowed into a formal painting. In most cases, children were portrayed with the same solemnity as adults. The exception makes you wonder, maybe the rigid rules of expression were slowly bending, even then. And while paintings captured dignity, they also captured absurdity. Many nobles sat for hours wearing heavy wigs, elaborate gowns, and uncomfortable corsets. Men balanced ruffs and lace cuffs while trying not to twitch. The more you imagine it, the more you realize that the serious expressions were partly a coping mechanism. Smile too much, and you might spill tea. Wrinkle silk, or worse, ruin your expensive portrait. Odd historical detail: some wealthy families employed portrait attendants who held props, adjusted clothing, and even reminded sitters to breathe evenly. Think of them as ancient human Photoshop tools. They ensured your posture, expression, and dignity were maintained for eternity. And if you dared to grin, they'd nudge you gently back into decorum. Step back from the canvas and look at the gallery as a whole. You notice a pattern. Solemnity isn't just a style, it's a survival tactic, a social code, and, in some cases, a subtle mask hiding very human quirks. Behind every composed face, there's probably a secret laugh, a suppressed yawn, or a wish to chew gum and just forget the entire ordeal. Even the rare smiles carry hidden meaning. Sometimes they signal flirtation, mischief, or personal symbolism. But for the most part, your average portrait is a lesson in restraint, a visual contract between sitter and painter that humanity can be frozen, but dignity must remain. You leave the gallery slowly, tracing your fingers along the polished railing. Outside, the sun dips lower, casting long shadows across cobblestones. You can almost hear the faint whispers of all those centuries-old faces, a chorus of silent admonitions. Sit still, hold your composure, never reveal too much. And yet, in their restraint, there's a strange beauty, a reminder that even without smiling, people found ways to communicate who they were through posture, clothing, props, and the smallest, most deliberate movements. They may have been stoic, but they were far from lifeless. You step into the cool evening air, carrying with you a new understanding. The next time you scroll past an old photograph or painting, pause. Imagine the effort, the social rules, the hidden humor, and maybe even the fear behind that straight face. In a way, you're smiling alongside them, quietly, imaginatively, in a way that history finally allows. You wander through a dimly lit archive, the smell of aging paper and varnished wood filling your senses. Rows of early photographs and sketches line the walls, many faded, some nearly monochrome. As you trace your fingers along the edges of these relics, you notice a familiar pattern: stiff postures, solemn faces, and those same closed-lip expressions that have haunted centuries. The rule still applies. Humans are surprisingly consistent when it comes to presenting dignity over joy. In your mind, you step into a small 19th century French studio. A young woman sits for her first formal photograph, hands neatly folded on her lap. She shifts slightly, trying to find a natural position. Her teeth are hidden, her lips pressed into a polite line. The photographer adjusts the lighting, mutters something about exposure time, and gestures for her to hold still. This isn't fun, you think. It's endurance. Mainstream historical fact: early photographers often used clamps, headrests, and other braces to ensure people stayed perfectly still. Even a slight twitch could blur the entire image. This wasn't merely an aesthetic choice. It was a technological necessity. You shiver, imagining trying to hold a smile for minutes at a time. Muscles cramping, lips trembling, and yet you notice something fascinating. Not all expressions were entirely blank. Occasionally, a sitter would manage a faint, almost imperceptible smile. These subtle grins were often accidental, the result of nervous energy or private amusement. Scholars still argue whether these glimpses of emotion were intentional or simply artifacts of the photographic process. Either way, they offer a rare, humanizing window into the past. You wander past an old photograph of a group of men in stiff suits. Each one has the serious, straight-faced look we've come to expect. But one figure, at the far edge, has a barely noticeable smirk. Perhaps he thought the photographer wouldn't notice. Or maybe he simply didn't care. That tiny rebellion against decorum feels electrifying. You almost laugh along with him, imagining the silent joke shared across centuries. Odd historical detail. Some families actually commissioned post-mortem photographs, arranging the deceased in lifelike poses. Teeth, hands, and posture were meticulously managed. Smiles were virtually non-existent, partly out of respect, partly because death itself made genuine expression impossible. Rhythm. Technology demanded stillness. Social norms demanded dignity. Health, dental concerns, and exposure times demanded restraint. And yet, amidst all these constraints, humans found ways to assert personality, a smirk, a tilt of the head, a sparkle in the eye. Even centuries later, these small details communicate life, humor, and identity. And as you walk away from the archives, the soft hum of the fan in your room merges with your imagination. You realize that the absence of smiles doesn't mean an absence of humanity. It means that people were adapting, negotiating, and surviving within the rules of their time. And maybe, just maybe, we carry a piece of that restraint with us today in passport photos, graduation portraits, or corporate headshots. You pause, picturing all those frozen faces, and whisper softly, almost to yourself, "We smiled." Just very carefully. It's a quiet, comforting thought, a reminder that humanity endures. Even when lips are sealed, you step outside into a quiet street at twilight. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of damp cobblestones and distant smoke from chimneys. Above, the sky has begun to darken, stretching into shades of deep purple and navy. You can almost hear the echo of centuries-old footsteps. The nobles, merchants, and ordinary people who once sat for portraits, paused for photographs, or simply tried to keep their teeth intact. All those faces, frozen in time, still whisper their secrets through the centuries. You wander past the imagined galleries and photo studios in your mind, reflecting on what you've learned. It wasn't mere stubbornness or somberness that kept people from smiling. It was a convergence of culture, technology, health, and art. Every stiff pose, every closed lip expression was a silent negotiation with the world, a promise of dignity, a nod to survival, and a subtle rebellion against the chaos of daily life. And yet, within these strict rules, you see small bursts of humanity, a faint smirk, a mischievous glint in the eyes, the tiniest tilt of the head. These are the quiet ways people let themselves be seen. You realize that even when people appeared composed, they were alive with feeling. There's a paradox here. The more controlled their faces, the more carefully life spoke through gestures, props, and subtle glances. Odd historical detail. Some painters and photographers actually instructed sitters to think of a private joke to relax their expressions. If you look closely at some portraits, that barely their smile might be the echo of a shared secret. a fleeting amusement. Scholars still argue whether these expressions were truly intentional or simply chance. But either way, they show a human spirit striving to shine through restraint. As you stroll further into your imagination, you picture a modern viewer encountering these portraits and photographs. We often wonder why the subjects look so serious, failing to consider the intricate web of social expectation, dental reality, technological limitation, and artistic philosophy. The stillness we interpret as severity or melancholy was, more often than not, a carefully maintained poise, a momentary act of self-preservation, and a subtle form of expression. Now, consider this. In your own photos today, do you sometimes force a smile for the camera? Do you try to control every angle, every expression, every detail? In a strange way, you're continuing the tradition. Technology, culture, and social norms still shape how we show ourselves. And sometimes, it's the quiet restraint that speaks louder than a grin. And as the night deepens, you notice how comforting this idea becomes. All those serious faces, once intimidating, now feel like companions. They remind you that life is full of unspoken stories, delicate adjustments, and quiet humor. Even without smiling, people leave traces of themselves. And if you pay attention, you can feel it across the centuries. You stop under a softly glowing lantern and exhale slowly, letting the weight of history settle into your bones. There's a calm rhythm here, a whisper of continuity, a link between the humans of the past and the ones awake right now. You picture a gentle breeze lifting hair, rustling papers, and you let your imagination drift, knowing that the faces you studied are still here, still speaking in silence. And with that, you close your eyes in your mind, imagining those frozen faces now softened, almost alive. You smile quietly, not